This is Professor McDonald, and this will be some comments relative to Chapter 15, Dangerous Drugs. Both federal and state law prohibit the possession, the transportation, the importation, the selling, the administering, or giving away of controlled substances. Typically, these drugs fall into the following categories: narcotics, sedatives, stimulants, or hallucinogens. These drugs are manufactured or imported and distributed by organized crime groups based upon the marketing pyramid. An investigation of these crimes often starts with an arrest based upon a buy, and the investigation works its way up the pyramid scheme or structure. Investigators must be cognizant that entrapment is not used to obtain an arrest. Certain instances require warrants, and some circumstances can occur without a warrant. I can promise you this. Based on my own personal experience, you will encounter drugs not only from an investigative standpoint, but they even have an impact on other cases that you work. For example, a lot of thieves are drug addicts. So drugs is intermixed explicitly in just about every element of the different types of criminal investigations that you'll encounter in the field. Now, as I previously stated, the possession of dangerous and restricted drugs is prohibited by law. And this, of course, includes transporting, importing, selling, furnishing, administering, or giving away a dangerous drug or narcotic. The word possession means an immediate and exclusive possession under dominion, control within the intent to exercise control. That's of the individual. There must be knowledge of the presence of drugs, and such knowledge must precede the intent. Knowledge is a basic element as to the character of the substance involved. In other words, you need to prove that an individual knows exactly what they do have. The fact that a person, this is important, the fact that a person is a drug addict does not justify arresting that person. In Robinson v. California, 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that drug addiction is an illness and not a crime. So we can't arrest people for being drug addicts. Now, one of the major legal challenges that you have when you work drug cases, and other types of cases as well, is entrapment. And this is something that you've probably studied in your criminal law class, and if you took criminal procedure. Entrapment legally is an act induced by the investigator or his or her special employee, somebody that's working with you. This could be an informant, which would not have occurred without such urging. In other words, the investigator stimulates and causes the violation of the crime to occur. To avoid a defense of entrapment, no more pressure or persuasion can be exerted than that which ordinarily occurs between a willing buyer and a willing seller. It's not the purpose of the law to prevent the unwary criminal from being trapped in a crime. It is instead the purpose of the law to prevent the police from manufacturing the crime, that is, from seducing the unwary innocent person into a career of crime. So you cannot induce a person to commit a crime and then turn around and arrest that person, especially if they had no proclivity to commit a crime in the first place. Let me just give you a quick example. Let's say I've targeted John, who's a drug dealer, and I have an informant that knows the family. And he goes to his sister, who we have no knowledge of as being involved in the sale of drugs or even the use of drugs. But he's a good friend of mine. She's a good friend of my informant. And he pesters her time and time again to see if she can get drugs from John. So finally, just to get him off her back, she goes and she talks to her brother, who gives her some drugs, small quantity even, she then sells to the informant just so she can be done with it and get him away from her. And then he turns around, the police turn around and arrest her and her brother. Well, this would be an indication of entrapment because there was no indication or there was no precondition on her part that anybody even had any suspicion that she was involved in the sale or the sale of illegal narcotics. So when you face that type of situation where you essentially create the crime as the officer or as an agent of the officer, then you risk the chance of the defense using the entrapment defense successfully in court. And this can involve many other types of cases as well. Any case, especially where you're using informants. And there's a lot of cases relative to moral crimes with prostitution, things of that nature. It's one thing if a person, if you present an opportunity. Let me give you an example. When I was a postal inspector, we worked some theft cases. When we identified a person that we thought was stealing mail, we would have some foundation. It wasn't just, hey, let's just go in there and observe and test with decoy letters everybody in the facility, see if we can catch somebody. Normally we would have thefts that we had documented. We would analyze attendance records, talk to supervisors, and maybe whittle it down to 2 or 3 people that we suspected might be involved in a crime. So we had reasonable suspicion these people were thieves. We would then, in the normal course of their business, place mail in front of them that was similar to the mail that had been stolen. This is not entrapment, especially if they have shown a especially if we have shown that they have been involved in such suspected activity. All we're doing is presenting an opportunity. We're not creating the crime in their mind. So just another explanation of how the entrapment issue can come to play. As far as the drug scene, and again, when you get in these investigations, these are long-term drug investigations because, as they say in the introduction, you want to work your way up from the small-time distributor up to, hopefully, up to the individuals that are actually doing the importation of the drugs and even the manufacture of the drugs. These are long-term investigations. The drug scene itself is, there's 4 major categories. Narcotics, those are drugs with a depressant effect on the central nervous system. They kind of produce a euphoric effect. Then you have sedatives that depress the central nervous system, like narcotics. They cause both psychological and physical dependence. You have stimulants, which include amphetamines and methamphetamines. They stimulate the central nervous system and lead to psychological dependence. And of course, hallucinogens, and we'll have examples of these. Hallucinogens, they cause sensory distortions, which result in illusions and delusions. There's 8 major types of crimes of drugs on the drug scene. Heroin, which is a narcotic derived from the poppy plant. And just as information, the country with the largest growth of poppies in the world is Afghanistan. It's a narcotic that has 4 main characteristics. It obviously kills pain. It includes soporific, which means induces drowsiness and sleep. It can cause physical and psychological dependency, a feeling of well-being and tranquility or euphoria. There's different types of heroin, comes from different parts of the world. There's actually recently been an increase in heroin abuse in the United States. Cocaine is a stimulant derived from the leaves of the South American cocoa bush. Major country in the production of cocaine, of course, is Colombia. Produces feelings of exhilaration and euphoria. Freebasing cocaine, that's when it is dissolved in ether and heated to boil off the impurities then smoke. Crack cocaine is cocaine soaked in baking soda and water. The mixture is heated until the water is driven off. And then what results is pea-sized rocks that are then smoked. In this form, it gives the user a rush and an afterglow. It could last 10 to 20 minutes. Very, very addictive. And of course, marijuana, the leaves and flowering tops of a female hemp plant that grow in many zones around the world. THC is a major component. Then you have hashish, which is the resin of the marijuana flower that is dried and compressed, and hash oil. Hashish oil is boiled in alcohol to produce a vicious liquid. Then we have amphetamine and methamphetamine, known as speed, crank, meth, and crystal ice. It has the same effects as cocaine. It's often called the poor man's cocaine. Can be injected or smoked. produces kind of a flash or a rush, which may lead and last 2 to 5 days. I've been involved in I've been involved in cases involving all of these drugs, and some of the worst individuals that I'd seen impacted were those that had become addicted to methamphetamine. I've seen some families where the children are ultimately neglected, and the price and the toll that pays not only on the psychological dependence of the drug itself, but also the physical appearance of individuals that are drug abusers is just phenomenal. A chronic user of methamphetamine is called a tweaker. And we have some other drugs. We have phencyclidine, angel dust, also called PCP. It was originally developed as a general anesthetic for surgical procedures. It was abandoned for this use due to its ability to produce hallucinogenic side effects. It's a white crystalline powder that readily dissolves in water, commonly applied to tobacco or marijuana and smoked. LSD, synthesized in 1938 from a fungus that contains rye bread. It's usually swallowed in the form of impregnated paper tablets or thin squares of gelatin. A dose equal to a few grains of salt can produce hallucinations lasting 10 to 12 hours. I've also been involved in LSD cases. I was involved in a case in Oregon. I was the manager of the office, but we had a major task force involved up in the hills, actually, where we had an individual who was a major producer of LSD, and we had multi-agencies involved with a very successful investigation. So the drug is still out there. Ecstasy, first developed in 1912 as an appetite suppressant. It's a stimulant like meth and similar to LSD. Produces a warm, fuzzy sense of well-being and manic. Then you have Rofinol, which is called roofies, or the date rape drug. Still a very dangerous drug in today's world. Of course, a lot of the big investigations, and hopefully the ones that you'll get involved in if you work in this field, is the drug selling organizations. So there's many organizations that deal in the not only in the manufacture, but the importation and the traditional sales and marketing of illegal drugs and narcotics. You have various players in the stage, and I'm not going to read all these: the lookouts, the runners, the stash where the drugs are actually being sold, some of the gangs that you'll run into, and these are important. The mafia obviously is involved, has been involved in drugs. Mexican cartels are very predominant today, especially in the southeastern United States, as they import drugs through Mexico. A lot of these drugs are manufactured in Mexico, but some of them come up through Central America. You have the Colombians, the Jamaican gangs, Jamaican posses. You have Asian gangs, the motorcycle gangs, the Hells Angels, the Pagans. They're involved in drug sales and manufacture and distribution, along with guns, etc. Prison gangs, street gangs. So I mean, there's a lot of gangs that are involved in drugs because, number one, there's a lot of profit. When we talk about investigations, just real quick, you have pick-up arrest, which those arrests not needing a warrant. Basically, a individual is picked up based on the investigator developing probable cause. A lot of the cases that you work on, if you work illegal drug or you work drug cases, you'll be involved in controlled buys. These are the investigation of cases involving dangerous drugs, usually developed by one or more buys of these illegal substances. So you'll have an undercover officer or an informant who buys a quantity of drugs from a suspect. That transaction is often witnessed. Obviously you witnessed it. I'm not going to go through the various steps because I've been involved in many of these. But if I was going to send you in for a drug purchase, number one, many times if I can, I'll wire you up, but unless there's a danger in doing that. We would also search you to make sure that the defense later on can't argue that the drugs were on you before you went in there. And of course, we would monitor and surveil the actual buy itself. The key there is, again, is always going to be avoiding entrapment. So you have to have some sort of information, some sort of reasonable suspicion that you have developed about the activities of the target of the investigation. You just can't just go in and start trying to buy drugs, and what would happen, or as they would say, create the crime, having the government create the crime, which that gets you into the possible defense of entrapment, and these are challenges that you'll face in these type of cases. Of course, what you're trying to do is work from the low level up to the higher levels of a criminal organization. So when you do a buy, and I'm not going to list all the steps that are provided on page 283 with the undercover officer, informant, or whatever. These are the procedures that are undertaken when making the buys. But these things are, then hopefully you'll arrest the lower level individual, and then you want to turn him around and have him introduce your undercover officer, or even him make the buy himself, or introduce another informant to the next level up. And so therefore you work your way up the pyramid in what we would call a chain conspiracy. And the natural, a lot of times the natural next step after, let's say we have a target and we have an informant and he's made 2 or 3 buys at this target location, we would then obtain a search warrant, because the actual purchase of the narcotics helps us establish probable cause, and we know where the drugs are being held, where the purchase is going down. So we would try to get a search warrant, execute that warrant at that location, seize drugs and other related items, and hopefully arrest the suspect. And then hopefully maybe turn that suspect to cooperate with the police, and then work our way up to the next level. That's kind of the way these cases work. In the textbook, they call it working up investigations, and that's working up the drug selling marketing pyramid, which necessitates both buy and bust arrest, and arrest and seizures under the authority of a search warrant. So sometimes you'll actually make a buy and then arrest the individual immediately. And then sometimes you'll make multiple buys and then execute a search warrant, then arrest the individual, and then try to work it up to the next person. And there's different terminology they have here: working off of beef, lateral snitching, that sort of thing. You can read those yourself in the textbook. But again, these are the normal methods used. Sometimes you can do warrantless searches. If exigent circumstances exist and the officer has probable cause that drugs are present in an ongoing case or activity that they're investigating, then they can arrest without a warrant. And then, of course, once the person has their initial appearance, a probable cause hearing will be established and will occur before a judge within a certain amount of time. And then at that probable cause hearing, the officer has to testify and show the judge why he had probable cause to make that arrest. You might be executing a search warrant on an unrelated matter, and you're legally at that house, legally doing that search warrant, and during your search of the house you come across drugs. Or maybe you're making an arrest at a house of an individual and you see drugs in plain view. There's multiple ways where warrantless searches can occur and where exigent circumstances perhaps exist. Same thing with traffic stops. As you can imagine, if a state trooper makes a stop of an individual and during the course of that stop he develops probable cause that there are drugs in the vehicle, then he can search that vehicle and seize the drugs at that point. And that is all done without a warrant. Also conduct raids. A raid in drug law enforcement is an entry into a building for the purpose of seizing illicit drugs and arresting the occupants. Entry can be gained secretly or by the use of force, depending on the circumstances. Legally, the authority for a raid is a search warrant authorizing the entry into the specific premises to seize drugs. You might see these in a crack house. Maybe you have a dangerous individual who runs a crack house, and in executing the warrant you conduct a raid, and you might have to use a SWAT team to help you enter the premises. Again, in all these drug cases, the classic defense claim is entrapment, that the investigator or the police agent urged and persuaded the defendant to sell the drugs. And sometimes they'll even say that the drugs were planted by the officers, so in small drug cases. So these are the typical defenses that you're always going to face, and through your training you'll understand what entrapment is, and you'll know that you cannot create the crime. But if you have developed evidence that a person is involved in the drug trade or other crimes, then approaching that individual with an undercover officer is not entrapment if they are known and you can document that they've been involved in the trafficking of narcotics prior to your approach. Again, if you have any questions about this chapter, get back to me, send me an email, and this will end this dictation.